Now, Ableton's sampler is great, and it can do all of the typical things that samplers do, velocity crossfades and key mapping and some pretty complex looping, etc. But it also suffers in that it does what samplers do when they go to play different pitches of the same sample. It adjusts the speed of the playback. Sometimes that's a desirable thing, and sometimes it's not at all. For the most part, I want my vocal chops to retain tempo continuity, which is why I want to use Ableton Simpler instead. The main advantage of Ableton Simpler over Sampler is that Simpler takes advantage of the warping engine, so my samples can retain tempo continuity. Drawbacks to Simpler? There's no multi-samples, there's no crossfades, and even worse is the fact that I have to use the transpose command to tune and map the sample to the proper key. It's clumsy, but the results still sound better to me. Okay, big deal. It's a single sample. Here's where I can use the rack features of Ableton to make this simple process a little more interesting. I'll build an instrument rack with multiple samplers, each with a unique sample I can switch to on the fly with a mod wheel. Here's how we do it. Okay, step 1, identify a bunch of samples that you might want to use, and then consolidate them, Command J again. Step 2, create a new MIDI track and drag an instrument rack into it and load it with as many instances of Simpler that you're going to need for your sample selections. Step 3, drop your samples one at a time into a different Simpler in your instrument rack, and adjust the transpose feature for each sample so that each sample is tuned to the right key. Step 4, and this is kind of the magic part, you want to open up the chain selector and give each Simpler a single slot. This is how we're going to switch which sample we're playing on the fly. Step 5, open the macro tab and map a macro knob to the chain selector. Press Map and select the chain selector. Make sure that it's working by moving the macro and then adjust the range to the number of zones in your chain selector. Step 6, map the mod wheel of your MIDI controller to the macro knob you just created for the chain selector. Press the MIDI mapping button, select the macro, and then move your mod wheel. Macro should now be mapped to your mod wheel. Now, I can play a melody on the fly and dynamically select the different chop samples with the mod wheel in real time. I renamed our instrument track to L-Vox Chop 2, and I dropped all of my samples in and tuned them. I have 18 samples in this chain, so the selector's range runs from 0 to 17, and it's mapped to the mod wheel so I can dynamically play the chops on the fly. Now, let's try something in context. I have a demo here, I'll just drop this in against. Now, this is all just played in live. If I wanted to revisit any of this and tweak, the MIDI is all here for me to play with. So fixing a simpler selection is as easy as editing the mod wheel data. Really simple, but I've been able to kind of play in live like an instrument, so it feels a little bit more musical to me. So try this yourself. It's kind of a cool feature, using an instrument rack and lots of simplers to get your vocal chops to be a little bit different, not quite so nitpicky in the audio editing process, maybe a little more creative too.